Right, sir.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the third webinar on endoscope reprocessing. Today, we'll focus on new technologies, one of which is disposable duodenoscopes. It's such a pleasure to have everyone. We're very grateful to have a very outstanding panel of speakers and panelists. My name is Rahul Pannala. I'm a gastroenterologist at the Mayo Clinic in Arizona, and it's my distinct pleasure to introduce the moderator for this discussion, Dr. Mariana Arvanitakis, who is at the Erasmus University Hospital in Brussels. She is the head of the clinic for pancreas and nutrition. So I'll turn it over to her. We'll have the discussion with the speakers. We'll have the speaker panel, and then we'll have a Q&A session. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. The chat function will be disabled. And as a courtesy, please mute yourself, and please feel free to submit questions. We look forward to a very interactive discussion. So thank you again. And Mariana?
Thank you for the kind introduction, Rahul. So it's a great pleasure for me to participate in this WO webinar on this burning issue, and also sharing the air with this distinguished panel. Not only top quality, but also truly international, the spirit of the World Endoscopy Organization. So we have three stellar speakers. We have Brian Duncan, who's the Chief Medical Officer of Boston Scientific, and he's going to give us a talk on disposable endoscopic platforms, and also an insight of how new technologies engineering can help us, as well as a fruitful partnership with the industry. How can this help us to tackle this problem? And the two next speakers don't really need an introduction. Horst Neuhaus from the Evangelisches Krankenhaus Hospital in Düsseldorf in Germany, and Nagi Reddy, the director of the Asian Institute of Gastroenterology in Hyderabad, India, are both not only top skilled endoscopy, but also leaders in their fields in clinical research, and also excellent teachers. And we all learned by watching them during live demos. And they're going to give the viewpoint of the clinician, of the endoscopist, of new technologies addressing endoscope-associated infections, the viewpoint from Europe and Asia. And we also have on our panel Dr. Notanli Pausawasdi from Thailand. She's associate professor in the Faculty of Medicine at the City Raj Hospital, and also president of the Thai Association of Gastrointestinal Endoscopy. And also, I'm very glad to have another female endoscopist in the panel today. She's her interest in the field of endoscopy is RCP in US, also very relevant to the problem that we're talking about today. We also have two representatives of the CORE program, the collaboration of organized and recognized endoscopy units. This is centers that strive for better endoscopy. We have Shiwan Ko from the Bacon Internal Medicine Clinic in Busan in South Korea, and Deepinder Singh from the NMC Specialty Hospital in Dubai, United Arab Emirates. And finally, we also have Dr. Anaya Das from the Arizona Digestive Health Center. He's an expert in advanced endoscopy, but also in cost effectiveness. And I think this is a very important issue as well in this problem. So we will start maybe with our three speakers and then have the panel discussion. Please send in your questions through the chats. We'll be happy to have a very lively interactive discussion afterwards. So Brian, the air is yours.
Well, thank you, Mariana, and thank you to WEO and Rahul and the entire core organization for the opportunity to be here and to participate in this panel. I'll share my screen. And so as mentioned, I'm Dr. Brian Duncan. I'm the Chief Medical Officer for Boston Scientific Endoscopy and have a strong background in many years of practicing endoscopy and still do that on a part-time basis. And I want to spend our time today talking about disposable endoscope platforms and kind of the challenges and opportunities in not only developing that technology, but then bringing it out to the endoscopy community. You know, it's quite impressive to think about, but it's already been a number of years since this issue of duodenoscope transmission of bacteria and endoscope-acquired infections has really started to come to light. In the United States, this goes back to 2013, when our Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, our CDC, notified the Federal Drug Administration. The FDA is our organization that is responsible for approving and clearing devices to be used in the medical community. The CDC notified the FDA that they were seeing an association between multi-drug resistant bacterial transmission and duodenoscopes. And this seemed to be happening despite the fact that these scopes were being reprocessed and cleaned in accordance to the manufacturing guidance. And this has led to some patient impact. In 2015, unfortunately, UCLA, a very sophisticated medical center in Los Angeles, California, ended up on the front page of their newspaper locally because they had 2 patients die from endoscope-acquired infections related to a duodenoscope transmission. And actually, we owe a debt to UCLA because they have a very sophisticated infectious disease and microbiology group that was able to do some of the forensics that was required to really trace this back to 2 duodenoscopes that were in their fleet. And this experience has led to quite a bit of activity. This is a little bit of a graphic, just over about 6 years of activity, starting in that notification from 2013 all the way to 2019. Communication from the FDA to the endoscopy community about endoscope-acquired infections related to duodenoscopes has been the #1 communication from that body in the United States over that period of time. There have been 12 safety communications. This has led to 6 guideline updates and 4 instruction for use updates from the reusable duodenoscope manufacturers. Those manufacturers have also recalled 3 products as part of this effort. One milestone in particular occurred in April of 2019, and that is when we got some more clear data about the magnitude of this problem. The FDA, when this problem came to light, mandated that the reusable duodenoscope manufacturers do a post-market study to try to quantify really what is the risk of bacterial transmission from one duodenoscope to the next. That data became available in April of 2019 and was a magnitude larger risk than was anticipated when that trial began. So it became clear at that point from that study that 5.4%, essentially 1 in 20 patient-ready duodenoscopes that had been reprocessed using manufacturer guidance and best practice were still harboring pathogenic bacteria. This is not kind of environmental bacteria, but these are bacteria that are of concern and can cause disease in patients. And that led the FDA in the United States to put out another safety communication to the endoscopy community that said that the endoscopy community really needs to move away from reusable duodenoscope technology and into enhanced technology, which could include a single-use duodenoscope. Now, as an organization at Boston Scientific, when we began to look at this problem and try to quantify where could industry be helpful in helping to mitigate this problem, one thing that's important is to put this in context to the entire healthcare community. And I will have to say that antimicrobial resistance is identified by the World Health Organization as a top 10 global public health threat facing humanity. And it's predicted by that organization that by 2050, it will cost the healthcare providing community 1.2 trillion US dollars. So a huge healthcare burden for this problem of antimicrobial resistance in general, which highlights that this is not an issue that's going to get smaller over time or go away, and also highlights the need to have approaches to managing bacteria that go beyond pharmacology and perhaps leverage technology. The other thing that became clear was more of the root cause problem of what was happening here. In the beginning, this problem of duodenoscope-acquired infections was felt to be due to the tip of the endoscope. Now, this logically makes sense. That is the most complex part of the duodenoscope, as we know. Lots of moving parts there and places where bioburden and bacteria can hide and be difficult to clean. And this led manufacturers of reusable duodenoscope technology to change their tips in order to try to mitigate this problem with different portions that were removable and different cleaning applications applied to the tip of the endoscope. And some of these are commercially available now. However, as this problem was more carefully studied, it was discovered that this is not just a tip problem, but it affects the duodenoscope really from tip to tail. This is a heat map of publications that have documented bacteria harbored within a reprocessed duodenoscope. And you can see that it includes the entire duodenoscope from the tip all the way to the umbilicus. And the reason for this is that this is not a tip problem, this is a biofilm problem. Bacteria form biofilm. It's essentially a syrupy substance that they secrete onto the surface to help them adhere to that surface and also to protect them from the environment. And biofilm burden is difficult to clean from an endoscope. It's why we are taught to be rigorous about rinsing endoscopes, for instance, immediately after our procedures to try to prevent that buildup of biofilm burden within the endoscope. Because it forms really on any moist surface within the endoscope, which is why it affects the entire device. So with this as a background and leveraging potentially the expertise of Boston Scientific, we began to theorize that we could make a single-use duodenoscope. And while that may have seemed kind of a high bar to achieve 5 years ago, we as an organization are a leading manufacturer of single-use imaging technology. This is an image of Spyglass DS, which many in our audience probably know and use. This is a mini endoscope that passes down the working channel of a duodenoscope and allows for direct visualization into the bile duct and pancreas ducts in order to manage and diagnose disease there. That's a device that we've had on the market since 2007 and is currently in its 4th generation. We also make similar technology in other specialties. LithoVue, for instance, is a single-use ureteroscope for doing ureteroscopy and cystoscopy that the urology community has adopted. And so we have a long expertise in developing these technologies and bringing them to market. And we felt that we could use that expertise in order to manufacture a single-use duodenoscope. This would provide a comprehensive solution. It would eliminate the root cause of endoscope-acquired infections, which is biofilm formation, and really deliver into the hands of the endoscopist and to the patient a new sterile product to be used every time that a procedure was going to be done. And so we began this journey over essentially 3 to 4 years. And I wanted to illustrate kind of the robustness of collaboration between industry and the healthcare community in order to bring this kind of technology to life. We had over 200 development people within the endoscopy division to bring the scope to life. consulted 150 plus physicians in the process. We actually manufactured over 9,000 prototypes just in the development phase before we ever manufactured one for commercial availability. We had to develop a custom ERCP simulator so that we could do more meaningful benchtop research, and conducted multiple animal labs in conjunction with healthcare professionals around the world. We even did a clinical trial, which was not required as part of our regulatory clearance, but was required by our company and by the healthcare professionals that we serve, in order to demonstrate that this scope really could be used safely and effectively before we brought it to market with regulatory clearance. That led to EXALT Model D, the world's first single-use duodenoscope, being cleared by the Federal Drug Administration in the United States on December 13th of 2019. It allowed us to do commercialization early in January of 2020 and then expand that commercialization around the world. And one thing I should point out is that the FDA not only cleared this device for clinical use, but also gave it a breakthrough designation. And I'm going to come back to the importance of that when we talk about cost. But a breakthrough designation by the FDA basically says that not only does the FDA clear this device for use and for sale, but designates the device as having an important contribution to the healthcare community to manage an issue that does not have a credible solution and should be looked upon favorably. And this breaks down some barriers to introducing this technology to the market, and I'll explain those in a moment. Now let's change a little bit from the development of the technology and the challenges there to the challenges in introducing it into the endoscopy community. And I would say is that first on those challenges is really the endoscopy community recognizing that this is a problem. Endoscope-associated infections are hard to detect. The symptoms are variable in the patients that we serve, and the linkage to our ERCP procedures is also difficult to make. A patient that gets an endoscope-acquired infection often does not manifest that infection in the post-operative recovery room or even in their initial post-procedure stay after the endoscopy. In fact, it can take weeks to months for a patient to manifest an endoscope-acquired infection clinically. When they do manifest that infection, it can often be not in the pancreaticobiliary system, but away from it. So for instance, in the pulmonary and the urologic system. And so that lands these patients in the care of other clinicians that don't necessarily link this back to our procedure. And given those timelines and different variability in clinical presentation, it makes it hard as an endoscopy community for us to understand the magnitude of this problem because we often don't see it in our patients. Also, there's a belief among clinicians that our reprocessing unit has changed their practice and they've kind of taken care of this problem. That's actually not a data-driven belief. When you look at the data around enhanced reprocessing, including sterilization, it does not make this problem go away. And so it's something that we need to continue to be diligent about. We need to be clear in our communication, continue to study this problem, and make sure that the endoscopy community realizes that this issue is not gone away and is likely not to go away in the future. Another challenge is really, can the device do what I need it to do when I'm doing ERCP? And we're very sensitive to this. As a company, we serve the pancreaticobiliary space with many devices that go through the working channel of a duodenoscope. Our teams are in endoscopy units every single day around the world. We understand the difficulty and nuance of doing an ERCP procedure and are very sensitive about increasing any difficulty to that procedure, which is why we were quite diligent in collaboration around developing this technology and then testing it to make sure that the endoscopy community could be assured that it can be used safely and effectively. And in fact, we've supported and published multiple trials that have demonstrated that a single-use duodenoscope, EXALT Model D, can be used to do ERCP effectively in all grades of ERCP, all 4 ASGE grades of difficulty for ERCP. And it's been gratifying to see other groups like the ones from Drs. Bang, Hawes, and Baradara-Julu in Florida to have similar results where they've been able to very successfully use this technology across all 4 grades of ERCP and have compared it to that of reusable duodenoscopes. Another challenge is cost. As you can imagine, making a single-use device does include cost. And I will say, and I'm interested to hear more about this in our discussion section, that I would say that the healthcare community in general underestimates this cost of reusable technology. It goes beyond capital equipment and some of the chemicals that we might use for reprocessing. It goes into training for our technicians and make sure that that training stays current. It goes into advanced technology like drying cabinets and transport systems. And it also includes managing patients that manifest infections and the cost of doing that. We have cost calculators to help institutions understand the exact cost within their institution and where Exalt Model D may be helpful. I will also say that in the United States, going back to that breakthrough status, one of the things that breakthrough status allowed for Exalt Model D in the US is for us to get what's called a transitional pass-through payment from the CMS, essentially from the government. So government provided healthcare in the United States includes Medicare and Medicaid. It's a huge proportion of the patients in the US that undergo healthcare, including ERCP. And now if you are a patient whose healthcare is provided by that government institution, CMS will not only reimburse the physician for their professional fee, reimburse the endoscopy unit for their fee, but also an additional fee will be provided to pay for the use of a single-use duodenoscope because CMS believes so strongly that this type of technology should be made available to their patients. I would also say that the technology is not typically applied to every ERCP, particularly in the early experience of endoscopy units, and that they subsegment their populations into those that are most vulnerable to infection and then use the technology there. This is a paper that I published with Dr. Thornhill on duodenoscope-acquired infection and the risk factors that should be considered. This was published in December of 2021 and kind of walks through those risk factors that any endoscopist can use in order to make a decision about whether or not single-use technology should be used for their individual patient. And I'll finish the kind of challenge discussion around environmental responsibility. It's quite a thing to take a duodenoscope and then throw it into the trash bin after it's been used once on a patient. And certainly the optics of that can be concerning. I will say that as an organization, Boston Scientific takes environmental responsibility seriously and puts our money where our mouth is. Our company is committed to carbon-free neutrality in all of our manufacturing across all of our divisions by 2030. And you can see in this graph that we're about 50% to that goal at this point in time. In fact, I just traveled back to the United States from Ireland yesterday. I was visiting our plants, our manufacturing plants there. I had the opportunity to tour a 40,000 square foot clean room that was just newly built within one of our facilities. And that clean room is completely carbon neutral. So we take this responsibility seriously. In the United States, we have recycling programs for all of our duodenoscope technology and offer that to every institution that wants to use Exalt Model D, and we're committed to bringing those same options to around the world. So I'll finish by saying that single-use imaging platforms are really, we believe, are the future of endoscopy. On this slide is our portfolio of single-use imaging going back to Spyglass, introduced in 2007, Exalt Model D. We now have Spyglass Discover on the market. This is a optimized device to be used by surgeons and interventional radiologists for cholangioscopy and pancreatoscopy. And then most recently, in the second half of 2021, we brought to market Exalt Model B, which is a single-use bronchoscope really optimized to be used at the bedside in the intensive care unit and other areas of the healthcare provided institutions. So thank you again for the opportunity to be part of this panel, and I look forward to the discussion section.
Thank you very much, Brian. I think that you already presented the problem and maybe the solution, but probably we don't always know how to identify the problem. So I think that we're going to have a very good discussion afterwards. So our next speaker is Horst. Horst, please, the air is yours. You can unmute.
Yeah, welcome. It's a great pleasure for me to participate in this very interesting webinar and to give you the European perspective on new technologies addressing endoscope-associated infections. These are my disclosures. I would like to discuss with you cross-contamination in endoscopy, limitations of reprocessing duodenoscopes, countermeasures to prevent, in particular, duodenoscope-associated infections, and I will also expand to single-use endoscopes. In Europe, there is a perspective from many endoscopists and healthcare providers that the transmission of multi-drug-resistant organism, MDROs, related to reusable duodenoscope is mainly an American problem and is less relevant in Europe, maybe because we think that we are doing the reprocessing better and more vigorously compared to the US. But we know that these infections may go unnoticed because patients have other healthcare problems. Culturing is challenging, and MDRO are all serious concerns in endoscope reprocessing. They are resistant to last defense antibiotics. And there are several reports also from DISE, from duodenoscope-associated infections in Europe. And interestingly, a nationwide study from the Netherlands published in 2018 and performed at a time when the participants already knew the risk of transmission due to duodenoscopes, showed that 65 centers that participated and agreed to sample at least 2 duodenoscopes, sampled 745 sites of 155 duodenoscopes, and contamination was defined as any microorganism with at least 20 colony-forming units per 20 milliliters and presence of mouth-gut organism, so digestive tract bacteria. And these involve 10 different duodenoscope types from 3 distinct manufacturers. And the results showed that 22%, so every 5th duodenoscopes from 26 centers, that means 45 of the participating centers were contaminated, and 15% of the duodenoscopes with MGOs. And contamination was not duodenoscope type dependent. So the authors conclude the present reprocessing and process control procedures may not be adequate and safe. Now, it's another argument that contamination doesn't mean infection. But a recent study, again from the Netherlands, reported on the risk evaluation of dyes. They did a research on all reported dye outbreaks within the Netherlands related to ESCP, and the total number of ESCP was performed in the confined time period of these reports. And the results showed that approximately 1 in every 10,000 ESCPs led to an MDRO infection. So this seems to be low, but we're talking about published dyes. The actual risk is probably higher due to underdetection, underreporting, and false negative cultures from contaminated scopes. We already heard about the limitations of reprocessing duodenoscopes. All endoscopes are thermolabile, so very difficult to sterilize. It can only be disinfected. We have the problem of small, narrow lumen branch channels and the complexity of the distal mechanism, in particular in duodenoscopes, but also in echoendoscopes. And the Dutch study, they dismantled the contaminated duodenoscopes, and this showed damage and oxidation and incomplete and incorrect repairs of duodenoscopes. And this is closely related to biofilm formation, which means we have residual organic material, protein plaque, mostly in small channels, so also related to other endoscopes like gastroscopes or colonoscopes. Probably this is clinically less relevant, but we don't really know. And we can expect a bacterial cell division of gram-negative every 20 to 30 minutes. And we know that bacteria can survive on contaminated duodenoscopes for several weeks. What are the countermeasures? According to the ESGE and ESGINA position statement, patients should be informed about benefits and risks of ESCP, detergents and disinfectants in compliance with recommendations of the manufacturers, use of specific types of cleaning brushes, time elapses between manual cleaning and automatic endoscope reprocessing should not exceed the time of 1 AR circle, immediate bedside cleaning after examination, leak test, and manual brushing should be done before AR. The aim is to avoid biofilms, and in addition, regular microbiological tests should be done in 3 months intervals. This is quite complex, and we have the problem of the human factor, very difficult to monitor and to control, and there are several studies showing that the compliance is limited. And even if reprocessing is done onto optimal condition, there is a remaining problem. This is just one recently published study from a large US center, and they performed a randomized trial to compare double high-level disinfection, which is rarely done in daily practice, versus liquid chemical sterilization with ethylene oxide for reprocessing of duodenoscopes. So close to 1,000 surveillance cultures were done, and the results showed a remaining rate of positive cultures of 1.8% and 2.1% respectively. So no significant difference, but showing that even under the best conditions, there is a remaining problem. And the editorial on the same issue of the journal GI Endoscopy stated the persistent potential for human error likely means that even the best cleaning protocol may never truly allow us to eradicate all potential pathogens. And therefore, there's obviously a need, and as we heard, strongly advised by the FDA to come up with new technologies. And one is the introduction of duodenoscopes, which are now provided by all the larger manufacturers with disposable end caps. And as we see on the video here, they promised an improved cleaning capability. They come with an integrated or without an integrated elevator. But the question is, do they really reduce the risk of cross-contamination? And there is no proof for it. So there is an ongoing trial in Canada, prospective RCT, with the protocol that 520 patients will be randomized to ESCP with a duodenoscope with a disposable end cap or traditional duodenoscopes, and the primary endpoints post-reprocessing bacterial contamination rates and ESCP technical success rates. So we have to wait for the results if this technical solution is still enough to overcome the problem. Single-use duodenoscopes are now provided by 2 different manufacturers, by Boston Scientific, as we have heard, and Ambu. And the features are like a traditional duodenoscope, in particular with a 4.2 millimeter working channel. It's convenient that they are light-weighted. And this is just a short video sequence showing the functionality. So it's easy to maneuver. It has all the features as a traditional duodenoscope, lighter handle, and very easy to attach it here to the controller, just pushing the plug into the controller. And this video also shows the excellent quality of the imaging provided with CMOS chip technology, and also excellent maneuverability here for cannulation. The question is, firstly, the functionality is promising, and what about costs? And Brian Dung already referred to the study from Bank from Orlando. Unfortunately, we don't have a comparable study from Europe. And in Europe, we have, of course, the problem of different healthcare systems. But this is quite interesting. They analyzed the mean cost of reusable duodenoscopes per procedures in US dollars according to infection rate in annual ERCP volume. And the data show what is logical. The higher the infection rate in the unit is, the more expensive is the use of the reusable duodenoscopes, because you have to consider costs for treating patients with cholangitis and intensive care unit and so on. So it's a positive correlation with infection rate, whereas the more procedures you do in your unit, the less costly is the use of reusable duodenoscopes. So for example, if you have 1,000 ERCPs in a unit and a low infection rate, then it costs just 872 US dollars. And if the infection rate is higher, and if you do just 100 to 150 procedures, then it's nearly double the expenses. So a negative correlation with ERCP volume, and this may help healthcare providers and also units to make the decision if they switch, at least in selected cases, to disposable endoscopes. Functionality, the same group in Orlando recently reported on a RCT. There are several uncontrolled series, but this is interesting. Small study, 98 patients, randomization to ERCP with single-use or reusable scopes. There was no significant difference between both groups in rate of cannulation, need for crossover, and adverse events. Some minor disadvantages of single duodenoscopes: more attempt to achieve cannulation, easy passage, image quality, stability, air, water, button functionality. But we have to consider these are the first generation, so we can expect further improvement, in particular in terms of imaging quality, because this depends on chip technology, which is closely related to the consumer market. So we are currently participating in a large uncontrolled multinational series. 4 centers have been involved, all complexity grades of ERCP and different levels of expertise. This is, of course, another question. So if we compare single-use versus reusable endoscopes, then we can summarize and conclude that the risk of cross-contamination is eliminated using disposable scopes compared to a risk of at least 2.0% in duodenoscopes. No reprocessing setup needed for disposable, quite expensive for reusable. The single-use devices are easily available, whereas all of us know when we have reusable under repair, it's a possible delay to continue. Costs minimal upfront for single-use, but high per endoscope, whereas reusable are related with a high capital investment and also high costs for reprocessing and repair, and no cost for the single-use functionality. As I've already mentioned, we have to further results. So what are the potential indications? I think this is probably the European view. Patients with certain highly virulent infections of NDROs and risk candidates for infection, for example, immunocompromised patients with severe comorbidities and or risk of incomplete biliary drainage. But we have to admit, so far, there are no controlled trials to prove that this has a huge impact on the clinical situation. But it's very likely that we can avoid all of these potential issues. Then use in low volume centers, what I've mentioned, procedures outside of the endoscopy unit and or outside of regular working hours, ambulatory GI procedures, also for other type of endoscopes, for the GI tract comparable to ureteroscopy, cytoscopy, or bronchoscopy. So I would like to conclude, reusable duodenoscopes may cause infections with MDROs. High-level disinfection is essential but complex and difficult to control. The aim is risk reduction and preferably complete elimination of cross-contamination and infection. Reusable duodenoscopes with sterile end caps are promising, but the impact on contamination rates is under evaluation, and a complete eradication of all potential pathogens may be incomplete. So, what about single-use endoscopes? The advantage is no risk of cross-contamination, avoidance of reprocessing, easy availability, but currently still high costs, limited to selected cases. The environmental issues, we have to compare this with the total costs of reprocessing, also the burden of reprocessing, which has also an impact on the environment. Maintenance of reusable endoscopes is also relevant for costs, and functionality, as I said, promising, and studies are ongoing. So thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Horst, for clearly showing the clinical perspective of this complex issue. So maybe we can go to Nagi for the Asian perspective, and then we can have the discussion.
Thank you, Mariana. Now I'll share my screen. I'm going to talk predominantly on new technologies, endoscopic-associated infections of Asian perspective. Now, of course, Asia-Pacific region is a very heterogeneous region, and it's difficult to there's a lot of variations in what's happening. So what I'm going to concentrate is predominantly on the emerging nations, where the problem is a little different from what is happening in the Western countries. Outline of my talk is to talk first on the magnitude of the problem in Asian region, what are the current new technologies available, and what could be the practical use of these technologies. In fact, a report of the 10 health technology hazards of 2018 ranked failure to consistently and effectively reprocess flexible endoscopes as one of the biggest threats to healthcare delivery. There were, of course, reports that were there of outbreaks. But although these reports, old reports of 1.8 in 1 million procedures, is probably an underestimation of what is happening, this is not just related to duodenoscope, but in general, where we know that infections can occur. Until recently, all the outbreaks where endoscopic-related cross-contamination have been associated with major breaches in cleaning protocol. It's only recently that we've had reports where cleaning protocols are perfect and still we're starting to get these infections. So what is happening in Asia now? Again, as I said, we don't have good data, but there are few recent data which I'd like to discuss about. And this is a large study which not only talks about duodenoscopic infections, but in general, colonoscopy and sigmoidoscopy related infections from Taiwan, where from a database, they had almost 112 to 543 patients. Comparable patients who did not undergo the procedure were included as controls. And you can see that the infection within 30 days after colonoscopy and sigmoidoscopy was 0.3%, significantly higher from the control group. Most of these infections were diverticulitis, appendicitis, and so on. So colonoscopy, sigmoidoscopy has significant contamination in Asia-Pacific region. And of course, we know we have had episodes of large number of salmonellosis occurring and so on. What about ERCP? Again, this is a study, a 4-year study from a Chinese hospital, 1743 ERCPs. And you can see an infection rate which is significantly high, 13.5%. Majority of these infections were in the biliary tract. They were caused by E. coli and, of course, Enterococcus faecalis. And again, most of these organisms were resistant to the common antibiotics that we use, ciprofloxacin. So again, extremely high load of infection that you see here. And this is a study which came from the unit of Dr. Ajay Kumar in New Delhi, where they looked at 10 different US needles to look at, because these needles were reused in patients. And when they reused them, after reprocessing, when they looked at the bioburden, you can see that although culture positivity was only 8%, the detectable bioburden when they looked at ATP was extremely high. So reprocessing of not only endoscope, but also accessories is a problem in the Asia-Pacific region. Now, I go back to an old study that was published many years back, and the reason why I'm quoting this study is that this shows that it's not only a question of infections that occur even after reprocessing, but the question of reprocessing also is not properly followed in Asia-Pacific region. This was a study published from All India Institute of Medical Sciences by Vineet and his group, and you can show that 30% almost 40% of the centers responded. Only 2.9% of the centers were not using high-level disinfection, which I think is a low number. But when you actually look at what is happening in this, you can see that 34% of the centers used a soak time less than 10 minutes, which means that they were actually not properly sterilizing their instruments, and all 40% of the centers, forced air or alcohol was not used to dry the endoscope. In practice, when we do these surveys, we found that 50 to 60% of centers in Asia-Pacific region, especially in the emerging countries, don't seem to follow the protocol of proper reprocessing of these endoscopes. And of course, we also have this FDA human factor study showing that even in Western countries, 87% of the participants failed to completely clear the elevator with brushings. And again, you can imagine how much more this would be in the Asian region. The processing involves, I think, many steps, and one, of course, cannot completely remove this biofilm. And of course, now this problem of duodenal infection, duodenoscope-associated infection that came, although it's not been highlighted, although most of the reports are coming from the Western countries, you can see that there have been also reports from India. We haven't had reports from other Asia-Pacific countries, but from India, we've had this reported with CRE infections. The post-market survey, which FDA forced the companies to do, showed a contamination rate of 9% with a high concern organism, which mentioned earlier, 5.4. But if we actually look at recent meta-analysis of pooled contamination rate of patient-ready duodenoscopes, you will see that it's actually much higher. Even after high-level disinfection, it's about 16%. And even after double disinfection or ETO, it's still 9%, which means that it's extremely difficult to really remove all the infections from these scopes. And again, this shows the number of positive cultures after HLT. It comes down significantly, but very, very few centers would do a third high-level disinfection. Again, these studies are Western world. I'm trying to show this study just to emphasize that even very well done in the Western world, you still have contamination which cannot be removed. And you can imagine what is happening in Asia-Pacific region. And of course, single-use sterile endoscopes in other areas have been introduced earlier in the Western world. Again, the cost factor is a factor. And because endoscopy, upper GI endoscopy, duodenoscopy are not really problems, they were never considered seriously in this part of the world. So what happened actually was that with introduction of the duodenal infection, several manufacturers started coming out with devices, even before the single-use device came out with devices with a disposable end caps. And you can see that these are the available ones now in Asia-Pacific region. The Pentex one has a disposable elevator with the duodenoscope. Again, similar one, but they also have a disposable duodenoscope with the elevator also completely, which is, I think, an advantage. And to show you these models, we have, the STORS is still not available, but this is an interesting scope which has got a disposable, not a disposable, a recleanable elevator with a wire which can be taken out and then cleaned. Pentex has a disposable cap and a disposable capped elevator. So two models are available. And this is interesting because the study is looking at both these models separately. Olympus has had this in Asia Pacific region for a long time with a removable cap, actually a transparent cap, but they have this special flushing adapter which Horst showed earlier. And of course, with Fuji, you have both a disposable cap and the cleaning device that you can see here. And again, in Asia Pacific region, of the two single-use duodenoscopes, the one which has been available for about a few months now is the Exalt duodenoscope. The third interesting device, which is going to be very shortly available in Asia Pacific region, which probably is more practical, is the scope seal, which has just been approved by FDA. The scope seal, which is made in collaboration with the Olympus Scopes by GI Scientific, seals the distal end of the scopes completely with a plastic sheath on the biopsy channel. And it's supposed to prevent contamination occurring from the front of the duodenoscope, so that even the so-called inherent contamination occurring from a patient's throat and so on can be prevented. I think this is an interesting device, the cost of which is not going to be so high, may potentially have a high application in Asia Pacific region. Now, this was the first study, which is again done from Thailand. I think Nantali would know of this study, where this group in Bangkok compared two groups of patients, those who had disposable end cap and those without a disposable endoscope using a Fujinon scope. And what you can see clearly is that the group which had a disposable end cap had a much lower bioburden compared to a group which did not have a disposable cap, which showed very clearly that you can decrease the bioburden. Although the cultures were not so different, you can decrease the bioburden if you use a disposable end cap. This is the only study we have from Asia Pacific region. And of course, as I said, single-use endoscopes have been available with us for some time now. And this is again like the video that Horst showed you. This their use can be quite dramatic in one of the workshops that we're demonstrating, that you take it out of a box. And then, of course, the clarity with the scopes is quite good, as you can see here from the endoscopy pictures. This is actually a difficult endoscope with large CBD stones that we'll be removing. And you can see the quality of the scope is fairly good. There are two centers in India using this scope, one in Hong Kong in Asia Pacific region that I know of, where single-use disposable duodenoscopes are being used. We've also reported a combination of a single-use duodenoscope with a single-use cholangioscope, which can be combined together very well. In fact, the cholangioscope passes much easier through the single-use scope than the reusable scope because of a straighter inner channel that we have here. But what you have to consider when using these disposable endoscopes is the capital cost, the equivalent performance, the patient future, and of course, the environment. The capital cost is of course going to be much higher with these scopes. But what we should do is, can we afford it? What about the medical waste? Which patient to use it? And how do patients react to availability of such products? And let me just go through some of these pros and cons. The cost, of course, is something which is going to go against the single-use endoscopes. But then I think the economic model that Horst has showed you, that I'll come back to a little later, works out a little different in Asia Pacific region, because the cost of the procedures are much less compared to the Western world. I think Duncan has addressed some of these medical waste issues. But what we should really look at is both the hard costs and the soft cost. The hard cost is the capital cost that you have, the cost of setting up the unit, and of course comparing it with the cost of processing these reusable scopes. The soft costs are many, training the technicians, the cost of infection that occurs and all. And this is the more difficult cost that are difficult to estimate. And this, of course, is a study that Horst showed earlier. And it was believed that at high volume centers with low infection, at $800, you'd break through. But I think in Asia Pacific region, I would get these numbers further down. Most of the time, average ERCP is costing about $1,000. And unless the costs come down for the scopes to about $400, it's not very viable. So therefore, that's going to be a major problem here in terms of cost effectiveness. Of course, this is a study that, again, Horst showed earlier, that these single-use scopes are at present good for less difficult cases. For more complex cases, as the new generation scopes come in, probably they're going to be much more useful. Now, when should we use these disposable scopes? I think this is a very important factor, at least in Asia-Pacific region. You can see that we can use it in certain cases when low-volume centers. In patients who have multi-resistant organisms, in fact, we are involved in a large PREVENT study in a multi-center way to see what is the incidence here in Asia-Pacific region. And critically ill patients are not able to withstand a scope-acquired infection. For example, patients who had a bone marrow transplant or a transplant patient following liver transplant, maybe these scopes would be useful. And patients who are at high risk for bacteremia, those, for example, with sclerosing cholangitis and so on, maybe this can be used. But it's my belief that patients are going to increasingly request for these scopes as they come to know that these are available. And this is going to be a problem that we're going to face in future. Now, again, in Asia-Pacific region, we have to be very careful about how to select these patients for using these scopes. And this is, again, the recommendation that Stuart Sherman and his group gave recently. They would divide these patients into 3 groups. I would strongly recommend that we consider this in Asia-Pacific region, that we should use this single-use duodenoscope in patients with prior CRA infections or MDR infections or with recurrent cholangitis, for example, PSC. We could consider their use in patients with immunosuppression or malignant stricture undergoing chemotherapy and in certain very special circumstances. But in all other routine cases, at present, the recommendation would be to discourage the use of single-use scope. I think this is a very sensible piece of classification of patients, at least for us in Asia-Pacific region. So finally, what would happen in terms of the future as we look at it now? I think although disposable scopes have a limited use at present in Asia-Pacific region, their use is going to increase, especially as the price comes down. And if the price cost effectiveness balances out, then their numbers is going to increase, not only because there's a need for it in terms of infections and so on, but I think we're going to have a demand from the patients wanting this. Reusable scopes are still going to be the standard of care in patients in this area, but there are going to be certain modifications to decrease infections. And if these modifications are cost effective, like end caps with disposable elevators and so on, the cost of this would come to between $10 to $50, much less than a disposable scope. And if there are studies that are now going to be done to see the efficacy of this in terms of decreasing infections compared to standard reusable scopes, and these studies show that actually infection rates are lower, then I think this would become more often used in this area. So I think this is an interesting era that we're looking at. And in my own belief is that at least in Asia-Pacific region, disposable endoscopes, especially the duodenoscopes, are going to be used in a limited way in certain very strong indications. Reusable scopes are going to be still the standard of care. And until we get further modifications which can show decreased infection, they would still be the main endoscopes that we're going to use in our patients. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Reddy. And thanks to all the speakers for a very wonderful discussion. So we'll go ahead with a Q&A session. So maybe I'll get it started and then Mariana would kind of take over. Dr. Duncan, you had briefly mentioned some of the recycling and the sustainability costs and the sustainability concerns about this. So one of the questions that came up is recycling of duodenoscopes also costs. There's a cost associated with recycling, and it would be interesting to get some more data about the process of recycling. How does it make sense, or how does that fit in terms of the sustainability of our endoscopy system as a whole? And maybe I'll start, and maybe the other panelists can also chime in.
Yeah, thanks, Rahul, and thanks for the question from the audience. As I emphasized in the talk, it's really an important issue, and it goes beyond single-use duodenoscopes. If you look at many of the things that we use in endoscopy, I think we have an opportunity to enhance our sustainability efforts and our environmental responsibilities within the profession. there's no question there's cost. Anything that you do around reprocessing in the States, we have two options for recycling of Exalt Model D. Two different companies that we partner with and then bring those companies to the different organizations. One of the recycling options is to recycle to energy, which is a bit less efficient, but does avoids landfill. And then the other is to recycle to kind of individual elements. We don't reclaim technology into a new device, but we recycle into individual elements that then can be repurposed for their reuse. Each of those has kind of its own carbon footprint, if you will, and calculating that in comparison to reprocessing is important. I will say, don't underestimate the environmental burden of reprocessing. It's not only the chemicals that we use, although that's significant. It's the personal protective equipment that goes into that. There is a significant kind of carbon footprint to reprocessing as well. And I think that this technology gets better all the time. I mentioned in our manufacturing processes how we're moving towards carbon neutrality. It really wouldn't have been possible 10 years ago. But with advanced technology and it becoming more cost efficient, this is now becoming more realistic. I will say it's harder to bring these kinds of services around the world. Every country, for instance, has their own regulations around recycling and reprocessing. And often you can't transport across borders as well. So that kind of limits the scale and the effectiveness of it. So it's a complex problem, but we're dedicated to it and thinking about it carefully, not just for Exalt Model D, but really for all single-use devices.
Yeah, thank you. I think this is an important question, and we still have to see the full picture. We don't always see the full picture when the environmental impact studies, and we're going to have more and more of these. So I think this is a really exciting research terrain. I have a question for both Nagy and Horst regarding identifying the problem in our units, because all of us have experience with these patients. For example, hyalocarcinoma. We want to drain them properly. Want to start a chemo, but we just get them out of an infection, even when all the ducts seem to be drained. Do you think this is like a hidden infection related to the duodenoscope problem? And does it make any sense to have an audit in every unit to better identify the problem? Like, you can unmute.
Say by saying that an audit is, of course, necessary in all the units. And this is, I think, now part of all well-functioning units that we have audits to look at various complications of which infections would be very important. Now, HYLAR, of course, we know that drainage is very important. But what is often forgotten is that there are a lot of endogenous bacteria that are carrying with the endoscope. So even when using a disposable endoscope, there's still going to be a problem that if you're going to go in, you carry this infection from your throat or other parts of this gut, and then you cannulate these patients. If you don't drain them, they're invariably going to develop. It may not be multi-drug resistant organisms, but some of them may have that also. It's still going to be a problem. So I think it's a question of completeness of the procedure, proper drainage, which cannot be substituted by using any number of new technologies. And like you said, audit is, of course, I think a part of all the units now.
Yes, I agree. Of course, an audit is needed, in particular when you have several cases with indeterminate infections. And in particular, if these are identified as MDROs, then it may even be an outbreak. So we have to be very careful. These patients are under particular risk.
Thank you. And maybe I would like to have the input of our other panelists. Nathalie, how are things in Thailand?
Yeah, thanks so much, Mariana. I was just about to share my experience regarding the outbreak of CRE in my unit. A few years back, maybe in 2017, we had several cases that the patients became septic after having gone through an ERCP. I think it's about 5 or 6 patients within 2 weeks span, and all of them grew CRE, which is carbapenem-resistant enterococci. And from that point on, we started to audit and started to review the scope reprocessing. We thought we did everything correctly according to the standardized guidelines. But what we had done, in addition to what we did in the past, was that we started using ATP like a random check every couple of weeks with ATP. We couldn't really do culture because the IDT would not allow us to do culture. They're saying that it's too much of wasting of money and time. So we started using ATP every couple of weeks, which helped. And also what we are doing right now, which may be a little bit excessive, is that, so after we finish reprocessing each day, so we keep the equipment in the storage, and the following morning, we actually repeat the reprocessing from manual reprocessing and all the way through the machine reprocessing before we start using the scopes. I'm not sure if any one of you guys have done the same thing, but we feel that the incidence of CRE is decreased over the past couple of years. We haven't had that happening. And all of the patients who grew CRE after ERCP were immunocompromised. I had a couple of patients post-liver transplant who got septic after the ERCP. Luckily, the outcomes were okay. They responded to the antibiotic quite well. So this is what I wanted to share with you. So I just want to echo the suggestion by all 3 speakers that if you're in an area that you have a limited budget, and if you need to use single-use duodenoscope or a detachable cap, you might want to tailor that to specific types of patients, like immunocompromised and post-transplant, something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. That was really really interesting. I think that we're all going to go there somehow, and at some point, it's unavoidable.
I'm just wondering if any one of you guys repeat the reprocessing the morning of the procedure after having cleaned everything the day before. You guys don't do that, right?
No, they would kill us in the reprocessing unit if we asked for it.
I know, but you know, the nurses in my unit proposed that we do that because we had so much problem with the CRE at one point.
So Nathalie, what we started doing now is that after reprocessing the scopes, we put them in these special chambers where you have a laminar airflow, continuous laminar airflow, and also ultraviolet light continuously on. And this is shown to decrease post-reprocessing problems if you actually hang your scope for a long period of time. Of course, if you hang your scope on for a week, then you definitely have to reprocess before you do. But most units would not do reprocessing the next day itself. But one of the ways to avoid it is to have these special hangers, and they're now available commercially easily. And that, I think, could prevent. And also, maybe it's cheaper, at least for us in the Asian region. Costs become very important.
Yeah, but this is not the daily practice, as a survey showed also from the US in 2018, showing that only 53% of hundreds of participating units do regular microbiological testing, and only 60% double high-level disinfection. So, as I said, the compliance is poor. And this is a problem of reprocessing, what I think is unresolvable. And if you have a lack of personnel, which can, especially in these days, easily happen. Now, many are in quarantine, you have not enough personnel for reprocessing, that it's even getting worse.
Right.
So one of the problems also we didn't discuss in Asia-Pacific region, I think Nathalie, you'll agree with me, is about the storage. You know, the volumes are very high. Large volumes of scopes are done, and even if the ERCP scope is going to cost us $100, Brian, just a speculation, it is going to cost only $100. To store all these scopes, large number of scopes would require a large storage space. So in problems of environmental and storage space also is going to become a problem.
Yeah, one thing I might chime in though is that you're hearing more advanced technology, drying cabinets, ultraviolet lights, reprocessing again in the morning or at some interval. These are the things that don't tend to get captured when we're talking about the both the hard costs, soft costs, and then the environmental impact. You know, to double the now you're probably talking triple processing, Nathalie. You know, if you did a double HLD when it went into the cabinet, and then you do a single one again in the morning, kind of thing. And one thing we're certainly seeing in the West is post-pandemic. Horst makes a very good comment. We have a real crisis in our nursing and technician community with a shortage of personnel, which leads to a variability in experience, and that then increases variability in the reprocessing suite as well.
That is true. Yeah.
I have a question, maybe beyond infection. So we had the Florida study showed that the overall rate of cannulation was the same, but the single use had a cannulation rate with less attempts. But there was, of course, improvement to be done in the image quality, the pushability, and the function of the aspiration and the insufflation. And Brian, can you tell us a bit about the innovation cycles? You can have easily prototypes and test and improve, and also regarding ergonomics, lightweightness, all the things that we can also improve with the single-use endoscope.
Mariana,
yeah, happy to.
Brian comes, just to add another question whether Brian can add to this also, what you asked, is that most of these studies with disposable endoscopes have been done in expert units by experts.
Yes.
And then experts can, even if you give them a hockey stick, they can still do an ERCP. So Brian, what do you think if it is used by a non-expert, what would happen also?
Good one.
Yeah, so multiple good points in there. One thing to clarify on the Bang study from Florida, their cannulation attempts with single use were actually lower, not higher. They had 2 cannulation attempts versus 5. So thanks for clarifying that, Mariana. I guess 3 things. I'll start with the technology. Technology. One of the nice things on a single-use platform technology is that we can iterate faster. It's not a capital equipment exchange for that inventory in your cabinet in order to bring the next generation of technology into your endoscopy suite. In fact, the scope that's currently commercially available is already a 3rd generation for the Exalt Model D, and we have line of sight to another 3 generations, improving ergonomics and functionality, and maybe introducing some differentiating features that don't come on a single-use platform. So that's exciting to us to look at, and particularly around ergonomics. I'll have to say, I think all of us agree that, you know, our interface as humans to the endoscope really hasn't changed since the 50s. And I think we're finally starting to get closer to being able to crack that code on how can we improve the ergonomics in a way that is more diverse in the users of that technology across all users, regardless of hand size, stature, that kind of thing. And then just on better functionality as well. A bit also in regard to technology, you know, one of the things that you pointed out, Mariana, was the buttons and kind of their function. Having just got off a European tour of some of our manufacturing sites, one thing that I think most clinicians don't realize is that most medical devices, whether that's from Boston Scientific or other companies that we use every day, are essentially handmade. There's very little automation in medical device manufacturing because of the complexity that it takes. And that includes things like single-use imaging platforms. Buttons, on the other hand, we have automated. And that brings a level of quality control and function that is really spectacular. So I think in general, across medical device, as the cost of automation comes down and our ability to do it in a more sophisticated way increases, this will help to bring reliability and cost down as well, which is tightly linked to volume. Now, again, forgetting you talked about expert users versus kind of all types of users.
Not only expert users, but enthusiast expert users.
Well, as in all technologies, you do have to start with enthusiast expert users in order to safely bring that into the clinical domain and really transparently and critically evaluate its performance. Horst mentioned, as he's one of the investigators on a larger study that we've done, that study, which is ongoing and should be ending enrollment soon. And our more recent study actually does look at users across a gradient of experience. So we do have a study that's been published mainly in the US that looks at a gradient of users of different experience. It's not just those top expert users whose names we all know. And that showed the same utility as an ability to cannulate across the different ASGE grades and rates. And then we're hopeful to see that same as an international study, which is what Professor Neuhaus is part of, and you too, Dr. Reddy. And so we'll see through that study. It's an important question, and we plan to answer it with data. We believe we have that data in much more of a regional aspect. We expect that data to translate to an international experience as well.
That's great. Maybe I'll shift tacks a little bit. Dr. Reddy and Dr. Neuhaus were mentioning about the cost and what it would relate. You know, cost has different geographical implications. And we have Dr. Das, who does a lot of cost effectiveness modeling and has published on cost effectiveness in this sort of arena. So how do we really look at cost effectiveness across sort of geographical and you know, different sort of practice situations as we go about answering this question? And maybe this relates, Brian, to how your sort of company evaluates the scalability of this technology. So maybe Dr. Das.
Sure. Thank you, Rahul. The cost is a very important aspect, as we all know. I mean, there are some hard facts that we all know that I'll throw some numbers which may make it clear that 5.4% duodenoscopes are contaminated, but it's probably like 2 to 20% of all duodenoscopes are contaminated with high-risk pathogen. That's a very significant number. And, you know, like the FDA recommended, no reprocessing technique can completely get rid of the risk of infection. It can minimize it, but all of us can feel happy about things that we do in our cabinet or reprocessing. But single use is probably the only answer that definitively can eliminate the risk of infection. The point is that somebody brought up the question that contamination does not mean infection. Clinically, we just published our cost-effective analysis on this, which was sponsored by Boston, and we looked very critically of hundreds of publications. About 40% of contaminated scopes lead on to clinical infection. Some of them are very serious, could be outside the GI tract, like cholangitis, pneumonia. The cost of care for those infections are pretty high, particularly in the US. For example, if you have a pneumonia with a CRE, MDRO organism, and if you have to get into the ICU, which in about 50% case it's needed, it's almost $50,000 just to take care of that patient. The way Rahul brought up, how do you look at it? So it depends on the perspective that who is looking at the cost. Is it Boston Scientific looking at the cost part of it? Is it the patient? Is it somebody else who pays for the equipment? So the best perspective is the perspective of the society, which in the US literature is mostly the third-party payers like the Center for Medicare Services. They pay for most of the older patients, particularly a large majority of our ERCP patient. And the way that you compare with other technologies that you look at cost effectiveness ratio, which can be modeled. And we used these different numbers like, you know, the risk of infection, the risk of contamination, the cost of care. Some of these infections are not, even if you treat them, they get colonized, they keep coming back into the hospital. Some require hospitalization, some do not. So how do you look at it? So the way that you basically do a Markov model, go through the lifetime, it's very mathematical, and some of the numbers are estimates. So in our study, we found that you look at that if you have to gain 1 year of extra life, quality adjusted, good quality of life, how much you can pay. And normally, particularly in the US, it is kind of the number is pegged at $50,000 to $100,000. That means if you pay, say, $50,000 or $100,000 to gain one extra year of good quality life, then it's cost effective. So if you use a single-use duodenoscope in our model, the number was $62,000, that if you pay $62,000 to get one extra year of life, that's cost effective. For example, in liver transplant, you pay almost like $175,000 to get one extra year of life. So by that standard, it is cost effective. You have to do 79 procedures with a single-use scope to prevent one ICU admission. You have to do almost 550 procedure with a single-use duodenoscope to prevent death. So you can look at the perspective of the patient. Of course, it's great to have single-use duodenoscope. All patients want it. For Boston and other industry, probably it's good to sell this as much as they can. But coming back to the cost equation, the model, this will change. It's an evolving situation. And I think Dr. Duncan mentioned about currently the Medicare who pays for it, they pay about $3,000 per patient for using the single-use duodenoscope to the hospital. So the hospitals currently love it because they actually gain like $100 extra if they do the procedure. This is a part of a program by Medicare Services to get new technology. But in June of 2023, next year, that support will likely to go away. So it is unclear after that what will be the cost situation for hospitals. But overall, I think like everybody is discussing that select patients, very selective indications will probably where the things will go. And the US currently, another thing is happening silently. Most of the ERCPs are done probably more than 99% in the hospitals currently. And there is a big push by the government and patients and advocates to push this ERCP procedure or other complex procedure happening in cardiology also to the ambulatory sector, to the ambulatory surgery center. And we currently don't do that many ERCPs in our ASCs, but with the evolving cost situation, single-use duodenoscope will be really a good thing to be able to be done in the ambulatory surgery center. So I think it's a very fluid situation. We'll have to see who pays for it, how much the cost will come down, and functionality is pretty close. But I think single-use duodenoscope is here to stay, particularly for the patients. That most patients will insist on it if it is available. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Das. So maybe I'll ask this question, and then I also wanted to ask Dr. Singh and Dr. Ko about their experiences. But Dr. Reddy, there's a whole theme of questions, I guess, relating to Asia Pacific in general, but low-income, sort of middle-income countries. One is the guidelines on reprocessing. So I wanted to point out that the WEO has a guideline paper that was focused on those countries. But the questions relate to a general theme of can we do partial sterilization? How do we adopt these technologies as new technologies come up? How do we, adopt these in sort of the low to middle income situations or low to middle income or resource constrained environments?
Yeah, so this is a very important question in our part of the geography. I think as Ananya was talking, there's going to be a huge geographical variability in cost effectiveness. And in Asia Pacific region, I think there are, of course, two parts of Asia Pacific region. There are like areas like Japan, Singapore, Hong Kong, maybe to some extent Thailand, who are relatively better off and follow the Western standards where costing would be similar to the Western standard. But there is a very large section of Asia Pacific region from India, Nepal, and so many other countries where costing becomes extremely important. And in these countries, surveys have shown that the standard high-level disinfection is also not followed in most of the units. I think 50% of the units do not follow this. These guidelines, I would strongly ask them all to read these guidelines, which have been produced by the World Endoscopy Organization, chaired by Jean-François, and the committee which has produced this are very effective guidelines. And even in those guidelines, it's clearly stated that there's certain areas where we can compromise, but in general, you have to follow the standard pattern of high-level disinfection. Now, the type of solution you use and so on can vary, but these guidelines are very well laid out, and I think it's important to follow these guidelines to prevent infections. It was published in the Journal of Digestive Endoscopy in 2017, and I think this becomes a very important document for us.
And we've done a webinar. The first webinar of this series was on that guidelines. I would request the audience to also look at it. It's available on YouTube. And then the question of a rate of contamination, maybe anyone can take this, is the rate of contamination after full reprocessing. I think that data is out there, even the FDA post-market study, it's about 6%. That was one of the questions, but maybe Dr. Newhurst, do you see that similar rate in Europe also, even after following full reprocessing? What would be the sort of the rate that you would estimate?
Well, I've shown you the Dutch study, registry, a prospective study showing that the rate was even higher, although they followed the ESGE guidelines. You can now argue they did not all meet the required criteria, but of course it's very difficult to control in daily practice. But I don't know if it's in all countries, but at least in Germany, regular microbiological surveillance and screening has to be done. So there is, at least from this standpoint, a good control. But there is a remaining risk if it's 2% or 6%. This probably varies between countries and institutions.
Rahul, I agree with Horst, but I think the FDA survey was a post-marketing type of survey, which was done by the companies, and they gave a relatively lower 5.4 for organisms, high-risk organisms. A recent meta-analysis which was done showed the incidence of almost 15%. So I think much higher than the 5.4 or 9% that FDA was quoting, and in real-life situations, much higher.
Yeah, I think it varies. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I think the rate it depends on how closely you look. And even to do a good microbiological surveillance, that requires expertise. Where do you take the brushes from? How much aggressively you do? What technology you use? So it's underestimated. The FDA went for 5.4. That seems to be the magic number that works for everybody. But like Dr. Reddy said, it's been reported from Amsterdam, it has been reported up to 22%, which is really very high. Thank you.
Nantali, you had something?
I was going to say that I wanted to echo the one thing that everybody sort of says the same thing, is that there's so many different factors that influence the rate of infection. For example, at our center, at one point, the rate of infection was over 5%, anywhere between 5 to 10%. But then after we did the extensive training and teaching reprocessing course, and we did a small experimental, like we had all the nurses who were well trained in scope reprocessing do the entire scope reprocessing. We found that the rate of infection had dropped. But when we, but at one point, obviously we had some shortage of nurses. So we had to bring in non-nurses personnel and train them how to do scope reprocessing. We can see that the rate of infection goes up a little bit. So I think there's so many different factors that we have to take into account to determine the real rate of infection.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Dr. Singh, maybe I'll bring Dr. Singh and Dr. Ko in to get sort of the Middle East perspective and the South Korean perspective. So Dr. Singh, what's sort of the landscape in the Middle East, and how are you approaching this issue?
Thank you so much for the question, and thank you for the insight by everyone. So just to tell you one interesting thing, that we had done a study on the number of steps it takes for a reprocessing to be done, right from the type of collection, the transportation, the surveillance, the documentation, everything. So before and after, we had done what is the current state of infection, and we found out that there's a lot of inconsistency between the people and different units. So we put up the plan, and then when we had adopted the WHO guideline, sorry, we found that there was no significant difference between the infection rate, even though systems were standardized. In every process was mapped out that what is required and what is not required. Everything was mapped out. There was different training, different posts. A lot of unique sensitive training was done. Still, the infection rate was not increasing or decreasing. We expected a decrease, but it's not that very high. We have a low volume, but it was a sort of some of the things which we can see in other studies also. That definitely it's a human it's a manual process, and there are a lot of things. But infection rate will be to a threshold level, it can be controlled, but beyond that, it cannot be minimized. So there is a threshold what we follow. But overall in the Middle East, it is underreported, these type of infections. And I'm sure other countries will probably had this some years back, but it's underreported as now.
Dr. Ko, any insights from Korean region?
Oh yeah, thank you for inviting me. In my case, I'm not using the endoscope recently because I'm running the screening center these days. But in my case, it's very difficult to control the infection because our nation controls the cost very strongly. And if I want to use more devices, it's restricted by the nation. But in my case, I'm trying to control the infection using reprocessing machines and drying cabinets and other things, or trying to train the nurses. And recently my head nurse is threatening me to quit if I more pushes her. Well, so recently I don't have any experience in infections.
Mariana, do you want to ask?
I don't know if Dr. Caro, he's also one of our co-representatives. He just joined in. If he wants to give some input.
No, no, it's okay. Morning for everybody. No, I have the same thing than Dr. Ko. I have an experience in infection, and I use in our ambulatory center, all ambulatory. We have two different ambulatory center in Buenos Aires. I use it washing machines and disinfection mechanical, and I haven't up to today the infection through endoscope.
Well, I would like to go on that just to ask maybe a last question on other single-use endoscopes. Is there any, we can imagine single-use gastroscopes in a ambulatory setting, or I would like to have Nagy's and Horst clinical input on that, and maybe Brian to see if there's anything else in the pipeline.
Yeah, we have a lot of experience with bronchoscopy because I'm head of the Department of Internal Medicine. So out of the working hours, we use only disposable bronchoscopes. They are also now available from different companies, and they're really excellent in quality, imaging, functionality. And we have experience with both disposable duodenoscopes. So far, there are no comparative trials. We are waiting for them. And in terms of gastroscopes and colonoscopes, as you know, they will be launched or have already been launched. At least they are close to be launched. we have to see if there is a really clinical need. I think less maybe from the perspective of infection issues, although we have very little data on colonoscopy-associated infections, but from a logistical standpoint. So for small volume units outside of large centers in ambulatory settings, they are very interesting. We have still the environmental problem.
And also in bleeding and acute GI bleeding.
Yes, in an emergency, especially on the IC unit and so on.
In India, of course, disposable scopes would still not be cost effective in all settings. Our experience has been mainly with the duodenoscope, the cholangioscopes, the percutaneous cholangioscopes, and so on. But I think for upper GI and colon, disposable scopes, although theoretically look good, may be difficult to come. The reason is now we require a very high definition image because of what is happening in terms of enhanced images in these scopes. We require a very high definition to diagnose early cancers, the types of polyps and so on. And I think at present, disposable scopes don't have that kind of imaging. So for a mechanical function like ERCP, it's okay. But I think to have an enhanced image function for disposable scopes, it may not be cost effective. And I think that's the reason why still upper GI and colon will still be reusable scopes because of the quality of imaging that we have currently.
Yeah, good point. Ryan?
Yeah, happy to. So I think that's an excellent point. We often underestimate the sophistication of those upper and lower scopes that we use, and think about the navigation of the colon and the function that requires. So, and in general, in the upper and lower endoscopy space, the ability to tolerate increased cost around a single-use platform can be particularly challenging. And you could significantly argue that the risk is lower because you're not typically breaching into spaces where things can be harbored, like in the pancreaticobiliary space. So that means you're moving to kind of a logistics play for a single-use upper and lower scope on using it outside of traditional endoscopy locations like the ICU or emergency room. And there may be some utility there. That certainly is what's happened in the bronchoscopy space. And we may see that with single-use platforms as well. I think EUS is interesting because that does have similar challenges and maybe some ways more significant challenges in the spaces that it's accessing, and it's really a therapeutic device in today's day and age. And so that's something interesting to talk about. I will say that Dr. Neuhaus talked about bronchoscopy and using it off hours as a single-use platform. In other specialties, including the pulmonary space and in the urology space, there's very strong guidance on which cases to use single-use technology and to move away from reusable. And that's coming from regulatory bodies that are seeing the same infection risks that we are starting to see around duodenoscopes. And so this is going to evolve across all specialties.
Thank you very much. So I think we're running out of time. I would like to take this opportunity really to thank our speakers, Dr. Neuhaus, Dr. Reddy, and Dr. Duncan, for a very fabulous discussion and giving such a wealth of experience, and also to our panelists. And I think this sets the stage as we are seeing this rapid sort of innovation in ERCP, which is long overdue, that it sets the stage for this sort of industry, academia, clinician sort of discussions and collaborations. So we hope to foster these discussions. And so let me close with that, and a big thank to Mariana for moderating the session, and to Alexandra for sort of setting things up. So thank you again. We are very grateful for your participation.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.